last Facebook Live for the year of 2021. And as I think most of us would realise, 2021 has just disappeared in a flash. Anyway, so what we thought we would undertake today is a bit of a overview update on COVID-19, to try and cover some of the issues that people have live questions about. So before I launch into that, the usual disclaimer. The information contained in this presentation is provided for informational purposes only and should not be construed as legal advice on any matter. Right, that's the disclaimer out of the way. So who is Baileywick? Baileywick Legal, we are specialists engaged in both agribusiness and tourism. They are the industries that we focus on. Within those industries, we undertake a range of legal issues, from commercial contracts to litigation to transactional contracts, employment, estate planning, business succession, business sales, property, and the like. So what a lot of people don't understand necessarily is that whilst we say agribusiness and tourism, the legal issues predominantly are much the same as any other industry. Obviously, the specialisation is understanding and having knowledge in the specific industry you're dealing in. So I've spent, this is 21 years now within agriculture, in law, and absolutely love it, and it's the reason why we've specialised. So enough about me. COVID-19. I'm going to try, and it's not easy, as we'll go through and you'll find out, but today I will try to bring the COVID situation down to the business and what the business can do or should be doing or may be doing or may not wish to do in relation to people who come to you. Right? And so from a tourism perspective, obviously tourism operators have what I'll call patrons. They're not employees of the tourism operator, they are people who are coming to enjoy the tour. What are the issues around the requirement to vaccinate for those particular people? And I say that in the sense that the current requirements for vaccination, in a mandatory sense as issued by the government, only target workers, employees, and that's quite a significant issue and a distinction. So I've touched on there the issue of who is responsible, if you like, for issuing a vaccination mandate. Now, I guess the question there, and maybe the comment there, is that use of the word responsible is perhaps a misnomer. I don't know that anyone particularly is responsible for issuing a mandate. What we have, at least in Australia, is a situation where the governments have taken what I'll say is a leading role in respect to mandates and vaccination, and to try and guide the community, us, to certain levels of vaccination, so that from a government perspective at least, and economically, we can operate as if there was no pandemic, in the sense that we'll open our borders, open our businesses and conduct transactions and go on with life as we would have before COVID-19. Perhaps a utopian view in the circumstances, but I have no doubt that governments are extremely conscious of the need to keep the economy, both Commonwealth and states, running at the highest levels possible. I think from a social perspective, it's important that business continues. Okay, so in the sense of WA, we'll look at WA. Who's issuing the mandates? Well, as I said, that's the state government. On a state level, it is the state government that is issuing mandates. Those mandates are being issued pursuant to two pieces of legislation primarily. The Public Health Act and the Emergency Services Act. And the mandates flow pursuant to that legislation as directions. I'm pretty sure all the directions are issued by the Chief Health Officer of the state, who has powers to issue those directions pursuant to the Public Health Act and the Emergency Services Act. And just to complete that circle, the state has issued declarations under both acts. So there is a state of emergency declaration and there is a public health declaration. Those declarations have been renewed and continued on a regular basis, I think since about March last year. So perhaps one of the issues of misinformation that is alive is that the Commonwealth is driving the whole COVID response and mandatory vaccination process. That is, as I said, a piece of misinformation. The states are driving the mandatory requirement. The only thing the Commonwealth has done by way of mandatory vaccination is to, I think, issue declaration within the aged care sector that workers need to be vaccinated in that sector. That's the only mandatory process that the Commonwealth has instituted, and I think that was done in August or September of this year. So as I said, other than that, it's the state government that's driving the show. Of course, as I've said in perhaps one or two prior Facebook live sessions, employers can issue policies and directions with respect to their staff in the context of vaccination, and employers can do that irrespective of what the state does. So any employer within any industry has the ability to introduce a policy or provide a direction to the business's employees that they need to be vaccinated. Now there are some obviously particular rules around that, which we don't necessarily need to go in for today's purpose. I've actually covered those types of issues in prior sessions, and it's not really the focus today. The focus today is business and the issues for staff and for people that might want to enter your premises. If you're a service industry such as a hotel or a restaurant, CBH as another example where people, particularly at the moment, are delivering their grain to the wheat bins. So does a business, should a business introduce some sort of policy or condition of entry in relation to, let's just say, visitors to their premises? And we're not talking about employees. So the simple answer is the same as employers, is yes, a business can do that. There is absolutely nothing preventing a business from introducing a requirement for anyone who wishes to enter their premises to be vaccinated. Right? There are some matters that the business needs to consider in the context of introducing that type of condition, and that is, the privacy concern. So a lot of businesses typically will be covered by privacy legislation under the Commonwealth, and the privacy principles will likely apply. So the collection of private information is an issue that would need to be reviewed and dealt with and addressed. Similarly, and we talked about this before, is issues of discrimination, pregnancy, impairment, religious reasons. So there's a raft of reasons why I guess circumstances where a business cannot discriminate against someone in relation to the services they're providing. So to stop someone actually accessing those services, let's just use pregnancy as an example. If you've got someone who's pregnant, you require them to be vaccinated before they come onto site. Whilst that might be indirect discrimination to the pregnant person, it still might fall within the bounds of discrimination. So you just need to be conscious that you might not be able to apply that policy on a blanket basis. At the very least, if you're going to do this, get advice about these types of issues that you would need to consider. In the discrimination context, there is a defence of reasonableness. So if what you're seeking to introduce by way of condition is reasonable in all the circumstances, well then you may be able to directly or indirectly discriminate on some grounds. I'm just going to flip back to the warning I gave you earlier. What I'm saying here is not legal advice, and if you want to be introducing this type of condition, absolutely get some advice before you do so. All right. And so when I was preparing for this this morning, I did a bit of a search through the internet to see who else has introduced, what businesses, I should say, what businesses have introduced this sort of criteria of people entering their sites. And the most obvious one, which hit the headlines last week, was CBH. CBH, I think, is introducing a blanket condition. I think it's from 1 January next year, that if you've not vaccinated, you're not going to be allowed on site. Now, that's been put into the press last week. I'm working on a theory that CBH has obtained relevant information and advice in relation to that condition of entry. My concern in relation to that is whether CBH has the right to ban its members from the facilities that the members own. I'm assuming again that CBH has sorted through that particular question and has been able to introduce this condition nonetheless. So that's just one of the issues that arise in relation to that particular condition. A few other companies that have introduced this condition of entry is Telstra. Telstra are going to introduce this, I think, again from 1 January, might be actually this month, middle of this month. And it's going to do that in relation to frontline staff, those staff that would be in the public domain are more susceptible to catching the COVID disease because of their level of interaction with the public. Another one is Qantas. Now, it's not necessarily, as far as I can tell at least, it's not necessarily where you might be going into some travel agency to book a flight with Qantas. Qantas has come out and said, well, for international passengers, we're not going to fly you unless you've been vaccinated. Now, that's what they've said in the press. I don't know at this stage whether they've actually introduced that policy. I'm not quite sure how many states actually are open to international travel now anyway. So that one is going to be an interesting one to watch. But I think it's foreseeable in the context of how the state, and perhaps I could go so far as to say the community generally, are dealing with this COVID situation, that I think it's foreseeable that more and more businesses will be taking measures to limit exposure to the disease within their workforce, certainly, but also within their work site. All right. Just to flip it a little bit here, next month we are being told that the new work health and safety laws will be will come into force in WA, and those laws will apply to every person that comes onto a work site. So it's gone well beyond the confines of being limited to simply employees, and it will apply to everyone that comes onto that work site. And so a business's work site, if you like, a CBH, for example, again, their work site's going to be all their receival points. So as of next month, their obligation to look after everyone on that site from a health and safety perspective becomes real and enforceable. And that might be one of the other bases for the introduction of the condition of entry that it has. So next question is, what is the mandate? And that's an interesting one from the point of view of what the state government has done, I think for probably roughly the last 6 weeks or so. It's issued a vaccination mandate policy, and I've been thinking about this again this morning when putting some notes together for today's live session. What does that actually mean? My original thought was, well, it's all in the word policy, and it was really, okay, well, this is where the state government wants you to go. The mandatory vaccination policy is not a mandatory vaccination direction, it's a policy. It's a guideline as to where the government actually wants you to go. And I think I sort of departed from that view and thought, well, maybe the policy, because it was in written form and available on the net, was the manifestation of the oral direction given. I'm starting to waver on that. I think maybe it's more that is an overarching policy, and when we look at what the state has done with respect to Group 1, it's actually issued specific industry mandates dealing with a raft of industry and business types within Group 1. Now, the other reason I think it might be policy and the specific industry mandates then are what you need to abide by is that on today, I think today or yesterday, the government issued another direction specifically for critical business workers, which is the first mandate it's issued within Group 2. And so that critical business worker direction, and it is worker, right? So, for those businesses covered within Group 2, and covered by this direction, it deals with workers. It doesn't deal with conditions of entry to your site. It doesn't deal with that visitor context. And so some of the business types, I think, covered by this critical business worker direction are caravan parks, hotels, motels, restaurants, cafes, supermarkets, hardware stores, petrol stations. Right, so we have a situation where these this mandatory vaccination direction now is starting to further pervade normal life. All right, and when I say normal life, I say, well, the normal life is people going to hotels, motels, restaurants, supermarkets, hardware stores. Everyone's down at Bunnings on a weekend, and of course a petrol station. You've got to fill your car up. So the issue, as I mentioned though here, is that the direction is for workers, and in the context of workers, again, you have a choice. A worker doesn't have to, he's not being forced to vaccinate. When I talk about misinformation, that's something here again. The directions really are that no one shall be allowed to work unless they're vaccinated. So the direction is not to get vaccinated. The direction is that, well, you just can't work if you're not. And so the employee, the worker, still has a choice. Right? I'm just going to read from the direction that was issued yesterday. And so paragraph 4A, on and from 12:01 a.m. on 1 January 2022, a person who is a critical business worker must not enter or remain at a critical business site if the critical business worker has not been partially vaccinated, right? So in the context of a 2-jab vaccination regime, you've got to have your first one by that date. So that's not saying the employee, the worker, must be vaccinated. That's just saying, well, they just can't enter and remain at a place. All right. So if we look at supermarkets, a worker employed by a Coles or Woolies or IGA or what's that other one around at the moment? The European one. What's that one? Laura? I forgot what it is. Good, different. Who's that?
Different.
Who? Good, different. Anyway, you'll know the brand I'm talking about. Anyway, so a worker in that environment is just simply not able to enter or remain at their workstation unless they have at 1 January that first jab. So it's not saying get it. It's not saying you have to have it. It's just saying if you want to be in that environment, you need to have it. And so the governments, both federal and state, I think have been pretty resilient on this message that they're not forcing you to have a vaccination. They would absolutely like you to have the vaccination to get the community level at a particular percentile so that we can open the borders and carry on life as we know it, as it used to be. But they're not saying you must be vaccinated. A fairly substantive distinction there. Right. But as I said, this is a direction in the context of workers. It's not a direction in the context of a condition for access to the site by others. So talking about supermarkets again, I could go to a supermarket, buy all my goods and not have to be vaccinated because I'm not an employee there. I'm not a worker engaged by that supermarket. And that I think is a point of discussion. I know I've had this discussion with very many people. Well, it's all good and well to say your employees need to be vaccinated, but when you have people coming to your shop who aren't, what's the go there, right? I've got no answer for that. I really don't. There is clearly a distinction between visitors and workers in that sense. And perhaps, this is how I rationalise that as an issue, in that from a government's perspective, from a policy environment, the government's wanting everyone to be vaccinated. It's concentrating on workers at this stage. And I think perhaps an underlying theory here is that, well, most of us work. Most of the people within the community have a job. All right? And even if it's only part-time or casual, it's a job. And for the person to be able to continue with that work, they're going to have to be vaccinated at some point in time. Therefore, you work on the presumption that anyone coming into your shop, into your supermarket, is more than likely going to be vaccinated because they will be working somewhere else. So that's how I rationalise it. I could be right, I could be wrong. I'm not sure that there is a right or wrong, but anyway. Right, okay. So you're owning a supermarket, or you're down on the farm, you've got a contractor coming in and they're not vaccinated. What can you do about it? Well, on the face of it, nothing. There's nothing to prevent that unvaccinated person from attending on your farm. All right. Or if you're a tourism operator, for attending your tour, nothing. You might wish to, or you might think you should, or you might not be bothered about introducing a condition of entry to your farm or tour for a person to be vaccinated. As I said, you certainly have the right to introduce that type of condition, so long as you've covered off on the issues of privacy and discrimination and any other potential impediment to the introduction to that condition of entry. But once you've developed, and if you have implemented that condition of entry, the best thing for you to do is actually enforce it. And I know enforcement in the context of policies and conditions sometimes is sort of left wavering. In these circumstances, though, I think if you're going to introduce that condition of entry, you've made a definitive decision about obligations to vaccinate. And I think if you then fail to enforce that, you're probably letting yourself down as well as everyone else in that context. So there's no rule or mandate at the moment that requires someone visiting your site or your farm or being on your tour to be vaccinated. That may certainly come in time, but at this stage there isn't. If you want to introduce that type of condition of entry, go through the right processes, and as I said, it would be worth your while to ensure you enforce it. In the sense of consultation, this sort of more pervades the employee-employer relationship at this stage, so I'm not really going to cover that. If you running your business from a particular work site, irrespective of whether you own that site or are leasing that site, you make the rules in this with respect to conditions for entry to that site, by and large. And in the sense of this consultation issue, you don't necessarily need to consult anyone. Who would you consult? A potential person that might come to your site? That sort of issue is a bit of a nonsense at the moment. in the context of this particular issue, I've done some work for Tourism Tourism Council, and the reality is that you can introduce this condition of entry policy or condition of entry term. You don't need to consult anyone necessarily, but you do need to be wary of some of the legal issues around privacy and discrimination, particularly. All right. Coming towards the end of today's session, how do you get your head around the continuing changing rules in relation to COVID? The simple answer is it's not easy. And whilst there appears to be a plethora of information out there available to you, you just Google COVID-19 on the website, any question you like, and you'll come up with lots of hits. Perhaps what I find particularly frustrating is that the state government has a dedicated COVID-19 website. Unfortunately, my perception, it looks like there's more information about COVID-19 on the Health Department website. And so we've obviously got two centres within the state that are sort of dealing with different things. Now, there's a link from the Health Department website to the COVID-19 website, but as I said, it seems to me that the better and more full information is on the Health Department website. So I can understand this concept that it's hard to understand the rules as they continue to change, and maybe the state government needs to do a bit more on its communication strategy. All right, so you've introduced this condition of entry. You're in category 2. You've just been given a mandatory mandate about your vaccination mandate about your mandatory vaccination direction about your workers. What if you don't comply, and what if you find out, what if you know of someone who isn't complying? Really good questions in the sense of where all this is going and your rights and obligations. The reality is those very sparse information, if any at all, about the answers to these questions, right? So, all right, well, you found someone who's meant to have complied, let's say, within the Group 1 industry. So they should have had their jab by 1 December, but they haven't. And the employer's doing nothing about that. Well, what do you do? Can you report it to someone? My guess is yes, you probably can report it to. One assumes perhaps the Chief Health Officer or the Chief Health Officer's department or contact. I don't know who that is, by the way, but I think that's probably someone you can report it to. And the same question arises there as the same as the question of, well, who's undertaking the audit? All right, well, who's actually out there checking to see whether a business has enforced the vaccination requirement? Again, in my notes this morning, I've just said no idea. I have no idea who's going to be auditing these mandatory vaccination directions within industry. No idea whatsoever. Will it be the police? Possibly. Will it be some person nominated by the Chief Health Officer? Possibly. Will it be someone from WorkSafe? Possibly. Just don't know. And I've not read anything from the government, at least, to identify who these mystical people might be. I'm hoping that at some point in the not too distant future we'll have an answer. But what we do know and what we can tell you is that the mandatory vaccination directions can be enforced by the Chief Health Officer, or that's the person who makes these directions, or the person appointed by the Chief Health Officer to undertake that enforcement process. Now that process is enshrined within the Public Health Act and the Emergency Services Act, so we know that they can be enforced. We just don't know how that whole process is going to be audited and possibly enforced. The other thing we do know is that these directions contain notice of the penalties involved, right? So it's an offence for a person to fail without reasonable excuse to comply with any of these directions, punishable by a fine of up to $20,000 for an individual and $100,000 for bodies corporate. So they're not necessarily super high fines, but they're not insignificant either. And so I think the cautionary approach, and as a lawyer I'll have to tell you what the cautionary approach is, it's basically comply. The mandatory vaccination direction has been reduced to writing. For all intents and purposes, it's legal and valid. I haven't undertaken assessment as to the validity of the direction. I know there is a case over east where the directions are subject to judicial review. I think that's in New South Wales. I don't know where that case is finished up at this stage though. So I think though, from a cautionary perspective, and working from the policy direction the state has given us, it's probably going to be better where people comply rather than not. Why take the risk of getting a fine when compliance is reasonably straightforward? You know what you need to do. So I'm hoping that sort of covers off on the questions, some of the sort of questions that have certainly been in my mind in relation to the mandatory vaccine directions and issues, and perhaps those areas which haven't been touched upon, such as the visitor entry to your business, rather than the emphasis where these directions go to your workers. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to wish you all a Merry Christmas and New Year, and look forward to catching up with you in 2022. Haven't decided yet when the first live will happen, but I suspect probably February. If you have any questions in relation to what we've discussed today, or wish to catch up with me on any issue within agricultural or tourism, we have experienced personnel who can attend to that, including myself, and we're happy to have a chat with you to see if we can assist you in that context. Okay, keep safe and well. Thank you.